Hey, Shalom on this Independence Day here in 2024 in the United States. Today I'm talking about the Heresy Police and how this is simply just not helpful to anybody to be running around calling people heretics. You can read the information on the slide, the two verses on the slide, but basically there's a choice that we have to make here, and our example to the rest of the world will show us, which one of these scriptures actually applies to us. Because when those of us who have challenged the doctrines of mainstream Christianity and have come up with better solutions, better ideas, better doctrines, and we start to express it, we're very quickly called heretics and cultists and all sorts of epithets. Now I've been, doing this since the late 90s, early 2000s. So when the internet was kind of in infancy and everybody was anonymous, and it was quite brutal. Um, but we got to take stock here about making things too personal, because this type of language doesn't actually invite anybody to want to join us on the walk. When I was new, the people who were just so mean to each other, there's a specific group of people who are clearly taught that it's okay to call people heretics somewhere, because it's so reproducible here for well over 20 years. I've seen this, and people who are very comfortable doing this just understand that nobody is reading those words going, gosh, I want to go sit in a pew next to that guy. Ah, that guy sounds swell. Now, I know I come off pretty sarcastic what I just did right there, which can be off-putting as well. But when you're using this language, we're going to talk about what this language actually means here in a second. It's not helpful for the cause at all. And understand, and I'm going to be very blunt, if you think you have the authority to determine who is a heretic and who's not, you do not have that authority. That authority has been given to Jesus, to Yeshua the Messiah. All authority has been given to him, and he is coming back to judge the living and the dead. It's a very big topic in the Bible. It's for do not judge, for in the way you are judged, for in the way you judge you will be judged. We are very much discouraged from judging people. We are not discouraged from judging doctrines and judging beliefs and that, but actually passing condemnation, passing judgment on another human being is something that we really shouldn't be doing unless it's in the case of like sitting in a civil court or something like that. We do have to make judgments about doctrines, where we're going to worship, who we're going to fellowship with, but not to the degree that we can use this incredibly caustic language. God has a purpose for all of his children. And while you may not think the people in this other church that use the name Jesus or use the name Yeshua or use the name God or use the name Christ or Yahweh, you may not think that they're your brothers or sisters, but again, not exactly your call. We're all in a walk here, we're on a path, and the path is really, really long, and not everybody's going to come to the same conclusion at the same time. So here on Independence Day, we have to understand that we get to stand on this soil in this great country because our forefathers got over it. They put aside their doctrinal differences in order to take up arms against an oppressive regime in the in England, who are now our very close friends that we in Britain go to war together against the bad guys and have for a long time. We have a very blessed relationship with our former government. These people who took up arms to against the King of England in 1776, their ancestors, not that long ago, probably even their own generations, had been persecuted for religious differences. And I don't mean called bad words on the internet. I meant set on fire, chased, murdered, killed. And they might have even been on the other side of that. They might have been the persecutors, because we had a heavy influence of Church of England in the United States at that time. We also had Catholics, also had some Jewish people. It was a big mix of people who were able to see the common enemy and put aside their differences in order to establish a more free society. They saw the bigger picture. So here's a brief history lesson, and that is uh, with the Reformation. The Geneva Bible was the Bible of the Reformation. I don't know when it switched to the King James. It doesn't make sense that it switched to the King James because the Geneva Bible was the Bible that was printed small enough for people to have and people to read in their own homes. The King James was not that. It was chained to a pulpit. Um, but the Geneva Bible came out in 1560 after the Reformation started in 1517, and that began a period of incredible violence and volatility in Europe and England. And so the King James comes in 1611 and was an answer to the Geneva Bible because the Church of England is kind of a middle ground between Protestantism and Catholicism, and they have both in their country. They wanted a unified religion, so they came up with a unified faith. And if you read the front cover of a old-timey King James, it says it's the authorized version of the Church of England. It was authorized by the Parliament of England, and um, and so you had them trying to have a compromise type thing. But that period of volatility between 1560 and the early 1700s of religious just persecution and strife and change, and you get a new monarch and they change religions and everybody in the country has to change, and if you didn't want to get changed you get chased out. It caused a lot of people to move over here. It caused a lot of people who were sick of that. They were sick of being told what to do. They were sick of not being able to own property. At the drop of a hat, they have to go to a different church, or they get killed, or they lose their property. So they all migrated. They got on those rickety ships and came over here and set up a life. And then, over time, they developed a bond that was inexpressible, a bond that they didn't have a constitution. They didn't exactly know where they were going, but they knew they weren't going to have another state-sponsored church. That the different states were going to have different rules for that, and people were going to be able to worship freely and still get along because they had done so for quite a while. The sins of the King of England piled up so high that the people on this continent had to see the bigger picture, put aside their differences, their Presbyterian or Church of England, or I don't, whatever other denominations are over here at the time, and had to stop the squabbling and get along and put their lives and their fortunes on the line. Not only was this a continent, a place of religious liberty, the people for different persuasions had to actually get along from day to day to just exist. That starts to get you talking to your brother and talking to your neighbor. Today, we are at the tail end of our prosperity where you can do whatever you want to do in your nice air-conditioned house, and you don't even have to know your neighbor because you don't depend on them for anything anymore. And this is starting to cause us to decay. Our common enemies today are not carnal, even though it looks like it, even though there are wars all over the place. But here inside the United States, we are battling a spiritual war, one in which we all can agree needs to be won on a spiritual plane of existence. The topics that we agree on are plentiful. This rampant adultery, rampant homosexuality, remarkable open legal drug use, the incredible welfare state causing people to be slaves to the government, where they're giving up their freedom for some tasty lentil soup. We have these huge problems and in moral decay that we have to get together in order to solve. Discussing doctrine and disagreeing about doctrine is is going to happen. It's until the Messiah comes back and shows us all, the truth, and we may not even care at that point when he returns, uh, but not to the point of actually condemning your brother or your neighbor. And there's some of you out there. In fact, I even had a debate with a guy who was some offshoot of the Church of England who refused to call me a brother because I didn't hold to his doctrines. Can you imagine such a thing? Can you imagine two people who believe that Jesus is the Son of God not being able to call each other brothers? It's very, very offensive and very striking. But also is the reason I'm giving this message today. Because once you have those thoughts and you start dehumanizing the other person, what comes next? It becomes much easier to be violent against the other person, which is not what we're supposed to do whatsoever. The carnality of this nation has made Christianity an afterthought. And when people see us treating each other exactly the way the world treats each other, that doesn't make this an inviting place to be. Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, was crucified for challenging the doctrines of the intelligentsia of his day. They were constantly chasing him around Judea, testing his doctrine in order to try to pigeonhole him, to say, you're a Calvinist. No, 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 you're a Wesleyan. Oh, no, no, you're one of those Church of God people. Oh, no, 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 he's a Messianic. Well, he actually is a Messianic. Um, and they wanted to pigeonhole him. They wanted to put him in a corner so they could mock him and diminish his ministry. And that was not the behavior that they should have been emoting. His ministry was so much about compassion, loving your neighbor, turning the other cheek, understanding that people have made mistakes and done bad things and have to have an opportunity to repent and turn their lives around. He was not here the first time for the purpose of condemnation. So if we are to be Christians, we are to love our neighbor as ourselves and understand that this walk is a long walk and that we need some friends and allies walking with us if we're going to defeat these spiritual enemies that seem to be on every screen of our phones and our computers and around every turn at the grocery store, in the movie theater, and everywhere. We're going to need to unite in order to preserve the religious liberty that we have. A much bigger example of this is the Apostle Paul, which is why these two verses are on the screen. Paul was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, which means he was going to be the next Pharisee rabbi of Judea. He was going to be the next head rabbi. And his initial reaction to the way, the truth, and the life was to persecute it. You do understand that Paul was in a hearty agreement with putting Stephen to death. He was the heresy police. And do you think the converted Paul wanted his disciples, for lack of a better word, were Yeshua's disciples, but we learn from Paul as he learned from the risen Messiah? Do you think Paul would condone your behavior of calling another believer a heretic? We had words for people with doctrinal issues. He certainly did. He had real harsh words for one guy in a letter, but the next letter he softened his tone when the man repented. Do you think Paul would condone the behavior of waking up in the morning and making a meme to call a group of Christians heretics? No. No, he would certainly not do that. And he had the highest education of the land. Paul was a doctor of theology. He was one of these people that were savants. A savant is somebody who seemingly can just know everything and do everything right out of the gate. And Paul was one of those. And when he was in that realm of academia and authority, he was a tyrant. It wasn't until he was blinded by the risen Messiah and then converted by lay people that he softened his touch. And he had to go away for a while to learn the truth, to unpack what was true and what was false, and to actually decide it. And ultimately, he ended up putting himself under the authority of the disciples of Yeshua, who were all lay people. just understand how humble that man had to get. The incredible insecurity of the need to define your faith by condemning others is incredibly apparent. If you get up in the morning and you have to insult another church in order to feel good about yourself, then you should not be doing that. It's a fundamental difference. I know that I spend 20 years now working on doctrines, but it's the doctrines. It's not the people that believe them. The only people that I think that I've had words for are those who would call themselves teachers and lead people astray when they know better. If you've been to university and you have a theology degree and you know the origin of Easter is pagan and the origin of Sunday is pagan and the origin of Christmas is pagan, then you are treading on pretty thin ice. And that's a very dangerous place to be. But even still, my hope is that you would repent and use your education and your authority to influence others to go back to the ways of the first century Christians who attended synagogue on Shabbat and kept the holy days of Leviticus 23. And they ate clean. And we have plenty of evidence of them keeping the holy days after Yeshua was ascended. But even if you don't do that, we have to understand that everybody has a purpose in this life. And perhaps Yahweh is using that person who doesn't believe like me to do some other good or some other influence. Because it's the same thing that held true in the first century. In the book of Acts, when all those people were present to hear Peter and John and the apostles talking in tongues that they could understand, talking in their native tongues, every one of those people was there for a reason. And their whole lives had been developed so that they would choose to be in Jerusalem on that day to hear that message, to take it back to their homes. We have predestination and we have free will. And the two things work together to where people know things when they know them and they don't when they don't. And how all this is going to work out in the end, we may be shown when the books are open. But we need to pray that each one of us is found with our name written in the book of life. It takes years to get a handle on this stuff. And if your doctrine is true, why are you in such a rush to force people to believe it? Why are you so defensive about it being challenged? When they came to the Messiah and said, hey, these other guys are over here working miracles in your name or baptizing in your name, and they're not followers of us. What are we supposed to do with that? He says, don't hinder them. Let it happen. You understand that the New Testament spread. The faith left Jerusalem in a very chaotic fashion. It was spread by hundreds of people, not just the 12 apostles. All of those people who were present on the day of Pentecost. Yeshua showed himself to 500 after he was resurrected. They all went their separate ways. And the miracle of it is that the Holy Spirit kept it cohesive, so that when Paul goes to the Council of Jerusalem, they all had the same idea. We're not going to make them convert to Judaism. We're going to let them attend synagogue and hear Moses, and they will work it out over time. So understand that that's how the faith is supposed to work out. It's supposed to work out over time, and we're supposed to understand things as the Spirit directs us on God's timeline, not on somebody else's. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. He and Yahweh allowed this country to be birthed over centuries. Each person coming over here having a purpose. Our ancestries are not accidents. The fact that we're here today is not an accident. God used that violence in Europe to motivate people he wanted to come over here. He does these things. He causes wars and nations to rise up and go down so that the people are where they are supposed to be. We all know this. We all know the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine were used to put 70 people in Egypt so 2 million could come out. He didn't stop doing those things. He continues all the way until the end of this age, when the Messiah comes back and the dead are resurrected and we rise to meet him in the air. God is in complete control of this world, and Judgment Day will come. Using language against each other that is associated with the murder of Christians is not what you want to be found doing when the Messiah comes back. What happens if you go to work and you assume authority that your boss did not give you? Not a comfortable place to be. Believers showing public vitriol for each other is also not inviting anybody to join us. Us treating each other the same way that the world treats each other on the freeway, with the cars and the tailgating and the screaming and we see all these riots breaking out in fast food restaurants. If we're acting the same way, then why would anybody decide that, hey, that's a better way of life? It's not. We disagree with doctrines and we disagree with each other, but we certainly must not condemn each other. That's a bridge way, way too far. And this nation was able to fight the British through the power of God. We were able to push off the most powerful army on earth at the time and secure our liberty. And we've used our military might to liberate Europe and rescue the Jews from the Holocaust and to liberate the Pacific. And since then, we've made quite a bit of mess of it all over the world. And we'll be held accountable for that. But this mess that we're in today here at home is not going to be won with swords or pistols or rifles or our military. This has to be convinced. People have to be shown a better way. They have to be shown that drug use and tattoos and piercings and choosing your own gender and living in this incredibly chaotic world of drugs and anything goes is not peace. That's chaos. In order for them to understand that there's an alternative, they have to have a place to go where they can find peace. And while we continue to have our doctrinal battles online, just take this to heart, that they're watching. So is Yeshua. Have a blessed rest of your Independence Day, and may you have all 10 fingers tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for listening. In Yeshua's name.